Okay, this is the third lecture in our series on natural resources in the Middle East. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the political side of the resource curse. Now, in the last video, we articulated some ideal policy solutions that countries might undertake to avoid the resource curse. We said they could control the exchange rate, establish natural resource funds, use financial markets to sell future oil, just leave the oil in the ground, and cooperate with other oil-producing states to limit output and therefore price fluctuations. Now we look at the political challenges faced by resource-rich countries, which make some people call oil a curse rather than a blessing. What we'll also be taking a look at, in addition to these political challenges, is a kind of puzzle. All of these solutions, these policy solutions that we articulated last time, are well known to most resource-rich countries. In other words, the remedy is well known. What's puzzling is that so few countries have managed to successfully undertake these remedies, and so many countries continue to fail to do so and therefore fall into what might be called a resource curse trap. Explaining why so many countries choose not to adopt these remedies is one of the puzzles that we'll be examining. Now, when a country discovers new oil reserves, or perhaps the price of its oil is temporarily high, its government faces strong pressures to borrow on financial markets. Now, a sustainable way of introducing resource windfalls would be to use future contracts, which we discussed last time. But borrowing has the advantage of receiving all the money up front. Now, a future contract simply establishes a stream of revenue in the future, a kind of annuity, if you will, where every year, or every month, or every day, a certain sum is deposited into the accounts of the government at a predetermined fixed price. But borrowing gives a country a lump sum of money. Now, if the idea is to engage in infrastructure or military investments, sometimes that's going to require large upfront expenditures, expenditures that you can only get or that you can only record by tapping financial markets in this way and having a lot of ready cash up front. But the problem with borrowing now is that rather than reducing risk, it makes a country's ability to repay the loan entirely dependent on future prices. If future prices are high, the country will have no trouble repaying the loan that it just took out. But if future prices are low, it's going to have to sell a very large number of barrels at that low price in order to meet its debt obligations. Now, this is actually ideally the opposite of what a country would ideally prefer to do. Ideally, you want to get the most from your resource base. Remember, the resource base is finite. Once the oil is sold, it's gone. It's not coming back. It's not being renewed. And so, ideally, you want to get as much money as you can for the oil that you have. And so, locking yourself into potentially having to sell lots and lots of barrels at a low price seems like a bad fiscal strategy. You want to try to sell as much of the oil as you can when prices are high rather than when prices are low. That just makes the most economic sense. Now, we said that borrowing is particularly useful if you want to finance large-scale infrastructure projects. Now, large-scale infrastructure projects like road and dam building, electrification, and so on and so forth are both very expensive and politically very popular for several reasons. They provide large numbers of jobs to often semi-skilled or unskilled workers, and this is very popular with publics in the developing world. They provide lots of opportunities for corruption for government officials, and this makes these projects popular with government. All the contracting and subcontracting and bureaucratic division of labor necessary to accomplish these projects provides lots of opportunities for diverting money away from its intended uses. Moreover, large infrastructure projects provide the impression of rapid modernization, and this is popular both with the government and the public. When you see these large projects come to fruition, you can't help but think that your country is becoming more modern and richer, even if the reality is quite otherwise. Moreover, they provide temporary booms in the sense that all that money floods the economy, providing temporary increases in wages, salaries, and living conditions of everybody involved. Of course, this boom is only temporary. The loans must be repaid somehow, eventually, and so the boom times must eventually come to an end. And this boom and bust cycle is actually quite characteristic of the development patterns of resource-rich economies. Moreover, the returns on large-scale infrastructure projects are not always positive. Not because they couldn't be positive, but because often they are so corrupt and so rife with make-work projects that they cost a lot. In other words, cost overruns are kind of an endemic part of these projects, and so projects that could have been economical at a lower price are become not economical at a higher price. The political pressure to provide employment, and remember, unemployment is likely to rise as Dutch disease drives firms, particularly export-oriented firms and farms, out of business, as well as corruption, means that the public's money tends to be wasted rather than invested wisely, and this tends to make Dutch disease worse rather than better. Moreover, the emphasis is often on construction rather than maintenance, so the projects go to waste after a few years when maintenance is not conducted because the loan repayments are sapping all the government's resources that might have enabled it to make these maintenance efforts. Right, so you have these big efforts to build roads or build an electrical grid or a power plant or a dam or what have you, and all of that upfront money gets spent, and even sometimes more gets spent because of the cost overruns, but then no money is left over for routine maintenance, and these projects often go to seed as a result. So borrowing to finance a big development push has been associated with the resource curse because countries go into debt when times are good, and then, of course, as inevitably is the case, when oil prices dip, that's when those countries struggle to repay those loans. Since money is not loaned for free, this is a fairly wasteful way of managing a finite resource. Even countries that are superficially rich, like Dubai, in 2009, asked its creditors to delay its payments temporarily because it could not meet its obligations. Now, Dubai appears very rich on the surface. Some of the tallest buildings in the world are in Dubai, and a lot of luxury, the appearance of luxury and wealth is everywhere, but it faces chronic debt problems. The oil pulled out of the ground, and in some ways was actually sold a long time ago. So a lot of people associate the slow growth of natural resource economies and oil-rich economies with the chronic debt that those economies face. Now, do all natural resource economies face chronic debt? No, some manage to manage their resources in more sustainable fashions. Again, Norway comes to mind, but in Africa you have Botswana as a kind of shining example. There are ways of managing natural resource wealth, but the puzzle, again, we'll come back to this, is that so often countries know what to do, but seem politically unable to bring themselves to do it. Now, there are some people who try to explain these big but potentially misguided projects and these sort of binges of borrowing as kind of inevitable consequences of the discovery of a new resource. They say that perhaps the discovery of a new resource or temporary price increases of existing resources act like a kind of gold fever, a psychological mania that overtakes decision makers when they happen. And so inevitably countries get themselves into debt because psychologically decision makers can't help themselves. Now, there's some evidence that this is probably not true. And the evidence largely centers around the differing responses of private firms and public firms to resource booms or increases in resource prices. Typically, private firms respond quite rationally by avoiding massive amounts of borrowing and often saving the good times in anticipation of bad times, whereas governments, more often than not, do the opposite. So if there was some sort of psychological mania at play, you would expect both the private sector and the public sector to behave in the same way. Now, there's no question that windfalls of cash are very tempting to spend. And it's very hard to argue that savings investment, well, I'm sorry, uh, savings and investment are hard for any government to accomplish because of the political pressures to spend now. There's always a political constituency or a political crisis that could use a little bit of extra cash. Um, and even if in many countries it's just the army whose salaries could be increased and therefore whose loyalty can be bought, there's always a pretty good reason to spend money now rather than later. And yet this is often economically irrational from the point of view of managing a finite resource in a sustainable manner. Now, an early and persistent criticism of resource dependence that's not linked so much to borrowing is that resource dependence, and oil dependence in particular, strengthens authoritarian governments. Oil rents enable autocrats to invest money in weapons, to repress opponents, or bribes to keep opponents quiescent. This is called cooptation. Right, so the influx of money enables governments to both bribe and or purchase weapons to repress opposition, and this makes sustaining an autocratic form of government more easy. Another way of putting it is that at a similar level of economic development, dictators could not otherwise afford this level of repression or this level of co-optation, and would have to bargain with civil society and other political actors, and therefore would be less autocratic. Another way authoritarianism is going to be encouraged by oil wealth is that oil wealth tends to divorce state revenue from the domestic economy more generally. The state gets its revenue from either leases that it provides to foreign companies or directly from controlling the exploitation of the resource. This has the effect of making it less dependent on the private domestic economy for its revenue. It doesn't have to tax anyone, and indeed tax rates in oil economies tend to be quite low for the private sector. But because it obtains only very little of its revenue from domestic private actors, that means largely it's not dependent on them for its day-to-day operations, which means that frequently it doesn't have to listen to them. So this is another way in which, even in more democratic oil-rich economies, you don't see or you see a turn towards authoritarianism. The state, you might say, becomes more autonomous from society in that it does not depend on society for its revenue anymore. It depends on either foreign companies, well, typically foreign companies either way, but it depends on sales that it realizes abroad. And so foreign actors become often more important than domestic actors in the political calculations of an oil-rich country. Now, in fairness, this might be a problem not with the resource itself, but the way the resource is owned, right? In most countries, the resource is owned publicly one way or another. All subsoil resources in most countries belong to the government. So if you find some oil or some gold or some diamonds on your land, it's not really yours. In most countries, everything that's under the ground will belong by definition to the government. So but if the resource were put into private hands, if it were the case that the resource were to become the property of whoever happens to find it on their property, it seems like these effects on the government would no longer be present, since the government would perhaps have to negotiate with the private sector and private actors, and would be dependent on the domestic private sector for revenue at that point. So maybe this is not a question of natural resources, but a question of ownership structure, how the resource is owned. But this will lead us to a distinct set of issues, which is the tendency for the government to neglect the non-oil sector. So we said that economies that discovered oil were at risk through Dutch disease of becoming oil dependent. A distinct but related problem is that the government begins to neglect the needs of its non-oil sector, the less revenue it receives from them. After all, if most of your money is not coming from there, you might not be that interested in developing it or seeing to its needs. So necessary investments in public goods, the creation of a reasonable tax code, necessary regulations to protect competition or consumers might simply end up becoming neglected by the government because the government does not see that these sorts of measures, or does not find that putting a lot of effort into these sorts of measures is likely to bring back a lot of revenue. After all, if Dutch disease is at work, those sectors are, if not fatally wounded, then certainly being harmed and not likely to be terribly competitive, so why try to invest in them? In other words, the health of the oil sector becomes the overwhelming focus of the government, and this can happen no matter who owns the oil. It could certainly happen in oil-rich democracies like Venezuela, Russia, and Mexico, and oil-rich non-democracies like Saudi Arabia and most of the oil-rich countries in the Middle East. If the lion's share of oil revenue accrues to domestic or foreign private actors, and let's assume that according to Dutch disease, the rest of the private sector starts to atrophy, then the worry is that the state becomes too weak for a lack of resources. Private actors may seek to capture the state, either officially by overthrowing the government or unofficially by corrupting existing officials. Even where resources are in the hands of the government, a worry is that the existence of an easy source of revenue is a sorely tempting target for insurgents or other governments. So the pot of resources at the end of the rainbow, so to speak, becomes an irresistible target for anybody who's trying to take over the government. You could look at Angola's ongoing civil war and Iraq's invasion of Kuwait as anecdotal examples of greed-fueled conflict and instability. So there's two mechanisms by which oil wealth might lead to instability rather than increased authoritarianism. And this, by the way, mechanism is slightly in tension with the view that oil permits governments to consolidate their control over society. One, if the oil revenue doesn't go to the government, if it goes to private actors, then those private actors may hire armies and private armies of their own and launch insurgencies with the resources that they have at their disposal. And what that can do, we see this, for example, with ISIS in the Middle East. ISIS is able to sell a lot of the oil fields, or the oil from the oil fields that it has captured, and this is largely what fuels its acquisition of weapons and so on and so forth. And so what that does is that it emboldens insurgencies and enables it to provide a serious challenge to the governments around it. So if oil revenues aren't going to the government and are going to private actors, the worry is that this is going to lead to a weakening of the state and potential rebellions on the part of thus empowered domestic factions. The other mechanism that we just talked about has to do with the fact that even if the government does have revenue for a while before it gets to buy weapons, it might be the target of some enterprising army colonels or enterprising foreign governments that might want to take it over before it has the opportunity to consolidate itself. And so, once again, you have potential reasons for civil wars in resource-rich countries. I would like to say that the evidence for this thesis is not as strong, but you can see anecdotal cases or cases where it seems like it might be the case that this occurs. Now, we said that volatility presents economic challenges for investors, but it also makes budget management for the state difficult in important ways. Now, the country would prefer that resources be managed for the long term, but governments are more preoccupied with their survival in the coming months and years, which tends to shorten their time horizons a little bit. This is true in both democracies, where coming elections might provide pressures to spend, and non-democracies, where the prospect of violent overthrow might be driving the decision-making among government officials. Now, it's worth noting that all the Middle Eastern countries that are oil-rich are non-democratic. State ownership, particularly in authoritarian societies where governmental processes are secret, tends to foster massive corruption. Particularly the ability to keep the real numbers about oil sales away from the public eye enables government officials and managers of the National Oil Company, the NOC, to claim that they really can't do more for the people as a whole, and since no one has access to the books, there's no way to know if they're telling the truth. All the while, these officials, both with the oil ministry and the managers of the NOC, tend to amass fairly large fortunes. In a way, this can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the problem of borrowing, which leads to persistent debt, can sometimes even make it true that the government can't, in fact, do more. Now, when the National Oil Company becomes the focus for government spending and revenue raising, as it often does in oil-rich economies, both of these tendencies tend to start presenting a problem. When the NOC becomes the locus for off-book government spending, first of all, there's no reason to think that National Oil Company managers are good at running social programs or even national airlines or hotel chains, as is often the case. Though there's actually very good reason to think that keeping such spending projects off the official books is a great way to distribute patronage and political favors away from the watchful eye of international creditors who are much more focused on the official books. Raiding the capital of the NOC for revenue, especially after the government runs into debt, has occasionally led the National Oil Company to not having the resources to do proper maintenance or the capital to expand its operations, which further weakens the government's fiscal position in the future. It's completely irrational to take away from the NOC the means of expanding production or maintaining current production, and yet we see this happen time and time again. In fact, undercapitalization is one of the major features of national oil companies because they tend to get raided so often by the official government budget process. Okay, I realize that we've covered a lot of ground, and no doubt we could still cover some more. The puzzle so far has been to try to discover why governments don't manage their resources very well, despite solid knowledge of what works. The answers we've explored so far include psychological reasons, something like oil fever, society-centered reasons where non-state actors are empowered in ways that make rational decision-making by the government impossible. That is to say, non-state actors provide the main stumbling blocks to governmental policies being rational. We have state-centered reasons where the state systematically acquires the wrong incentives as the logic of political survival runs against the logic of sound economic management. And finally, we have a variety of ownership structure related reasons, which say that the way the resources are owned conditions the state's response and leads to various political challenges depending on whether it's domestic, foreign, or parastatal, that is to say national oil company actors, that are the primary claimants on the resource.